fine occasion, and I know that Dan will probably be talking to some of you about the work that they plan to do at the Institute, and you might say a bit more about that tonight. But Dan, over to you, and thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for everything you do in the Trade Out of Poverty initiative. 10,000 years ago, one of our remote ancestors made the discovery that if you put seeds in the ground, plants grow. That was the beginning of the agrarian revolution. It was the beginning of towns, the beginning of human civilization. And I'm afraid that human nature being what it is, it probably took only one season for the next big discovery, which is that it's easier to nick somebody else's crop than to spend all year tending to your own. And then it wasn't long before those first agrarian fathers of ours made the really fatal discovery, which is that the best possible cost-benefit ratio is to organize the plunder of everybody else's crop through tithes, and tolls, and taxes. And thus was human civilization born in tyranny, and so it continued for the better part of 10,000 years. Slavery, oppression, caste, serfdom, these were our lot on every continent for almost the whole of the story of civilization. What we call history was really the history of the 1% of the 1%, while the rest of us bent our backs, dawn to dusk in the field. Until 200 years ago, the most extraordinary miracle happened. Instead of relying on ourselves, we learned to make exchanges, to specialize in what we do best, and to buy in stuff from other people. It's the easiest thing in the world to be blasé about what we take for granted. But the enrichment of the last 200 years is the central fact of your life. In fact, you're in this room tells me that. And the central fact of mine. If I think of the extraordinary changes just in my life, the wonders that we've seen. I was born in 1971. In 1971, the average British worker had to work for over a month to be able to afford a TV set. Now it's less than 2 days. In 1971, fewer than half of girls in the world completed at least primary education. Now it's more than 90%. In 1971, a stationary car emitted more pollution than a car today moving at full speed. That is the miracle of the market system. The fact that it's familiar shouldn't make us any the more blasé about it. So why is it, when we have this evidence around us of these extraordinary advances in human wealth, happiness, and freedom, that we're so skeptical about the system that has delivered those outcomes? Why is it that trade out of poverty is considered almost a slogan rather than a statement of obvious empirical observation? Why is it that idealistic people, altruistic, well-meaning young people in developed and in developing countries are protesting G20 summits, marching against trade accords, occupying stock exchanges, thinking that they are somehow standing up for the poorest people in the poorest countries against the big corporates, when in reality they are doing precisely the opposite? Nobody gains more from the distortions and the government rules than the big multinationals, and nobody gains more from their lifting than the poorest people in the poorest countries. In 1990, the United Nations set itself a 25-year goal to halve poverty, extreme poverty. Extreme poverty was defined as living on $1 a day or less in 1990 prices. In 1990, 38% of human beings experienced that level of pain. 38% of people on this planet. Now that figure is 8%. And where have the drops been most dramatic? Precisely in those countries, particularly in Asia and Africa, that dropped their protectionism and their autarky and embraced global markets. So when the evidence is so clear, why is there not a consensus? Why, not least in this country, are we playing defensively, trying to make the case that capitalism is at least acceptable, that it makes it pays for itself, rather than making the obvious case that it is the most ethical and moral tool because it is the ultimate medium of poverty alleviation and social justice on the planet. Well, you know what? I think the issue is fundamentally a psychological one. Free trade is counterintuitive. In the exact sense. Before that first seed was planted 10,000 years ago, we had millions of years of existence as a species as hunter-gatherers. And we have the intuitions and instincts inherited from the savannas of Pleistocene Africa. And at the top of that list is the instinct to provide against famine, to hoard food. We hate the idea of being dependent on other people. And yet, dependence on strangers is the miracle on which the whole capitalist system works. It's what elevates the species. It's what's given us Starbucks and starships and smallpox vaccines and symphonies. All of it comes from this idea of free exchange with people who may not even be particularly interested in you, who may not like you, but who pursue their rational self-interest. Our minds lead us astray in all sorts of ways. How many times in the last few days have you heard people saying, well, free trade is all well and good, but we now see that Donald Trump is always going to put America first. Look at those tariffs that he just slapped on the planes to protect Boeing. Look, there are lots of ways in which you can explain or describe those tariffs, but putting America first is not one of them. Under any conceivable definition, the main losers from that tariff will be Americans. That is always the way with tariffs. They may do incidental damage to somebody else's exporters, but they always do the greater damage to the country imposing. Again, we don't see it. Why don't we see it? Well, it's what the great 19th century French economist Frédéric Bastiat called what you see and what you don't. We see the Boeing jobs. Not that I'm sure there even are any Boeing jobs here, since they weren't bidding in the contract that they're now protesting. But we don't see the jobs that would have come into existence had cheaper and better and newer technology entered the aviation industry in the United States. We don't see all the jobs of the cabin crew and the extra people in the airports and so on, who now won't be employed and won't have all of their extra money to spend on other businesses. We don't see the way in which airfares would have been a little bit cheaper if newer technology had come in. And all of those passengers would have had a little bit more to spend on everyone else. In fact, every single American is losing here, including, in their capacity as consumers, quite a lot of Boeing employees. The one thing, as I say, that it is absolutely not doing is defending American jobs. It never does. But it's a difficult point to win. It's a complicated argument. How many times do you hear it here? Well, if we admitted all this Chinese steel, what would happen to our steel companies? Well, you know what? It is in the nature of competition that if you're dealing with a cheap foreign commodity, even if it's subsidized, you know what that means? You're getting a present from the other country. It's true that if we have tariffs on steel, we might prop up some jobs in steel. We destroy many, many more jobs in construction, in car making, in machine manufacturing, in the aeronautics industry. But those are the jobs that we don't yet see. These are the jobs that would have existed. These are the jobs that exist only in the subjunctive. That's the fundamental problem. It's a political problem. Free trade brings dispersed gains, concentrated losses. How do you win this argument? How do you show that you can trade out of poverty? Do you know what? You just do it. The countries that have made that leap have removed their barriers, have invited the traffic and commerce of the world never look back. Which was the first country to do it? We were. This city is pretty much a monument to when we were doing it in the Victorian era, not least the bit that we're standing in now. From the late 1840s, without waiting for reciprocity, we one by one removed the barriers that we had to the trade of other countries. And guess what? We became by far the richest place on earth. And how did we do that? Not by backing strategic industries, not by owning vast tracts of real estate overseas. The jury is pretty much clearly back on this one, that imperial possessions were a net drain on the treasury, whatever the other arguments for or against that. Why did we become the richest country in the world? Because we put more money into the pockets of ordinary people by allowing prices to fall. Why are we now arguing about whether to give the rest of the world the same privilege that we took for granted then? The ability to trade their way out of poverty, hugely enriching themselves and enriching us into the bargain. This is the best bit. You don't have to make other people rich through transfers it doesn't cost you anything. On the contrary, you become better off in the process. One example. No, none of you was probably old enough to remember the arguments about whether we should join the EEC in the early 1970s. But if you look back at the records from the archives, the big argument at that time was all about the price of groceries. Would the common market make food dearer? That was the phrase that was used. I can see somebody who can remember. There we go. Well, it did. Food prices went up 40%. Now, to be fair, there have been some reforms since then. The Common Agricultural Policy is not quite what it was. But still, if the OECD is to be believed, being in the CAP means that our food is 17% above what it would be if we were buying at global prices. Now, for some people in the room, maybe 300 or 400 extra quid a year in terms of lower prices would be a nice bonus. But if you're living on or close to the minimum wage, that is a huge, significant impact on your standard of living. And not only are you satisfied with the thought that you're allowing all the vanilla exporters in Uganda to prosper, as well, you have that extra money to spend on other things, so the whole economy is lifted. There are no losers here, just as there are no winners from the crazy Boeing pains and penalties inflicted on the American people by Donald Trump. That's the real magic of what we're doing. We're able to make people richer, and at the same time, we're able to make the world more integrated and more self-reliant. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's just go back to the thing we did best as a country, the thing that elevated us above the run of nations and brought our greatest moment in the sun. There's no magic involved, there's no special technology, it's simply a question of moving the rocks aside and letting the grass grow.
Thank you very much, Ian.